that down just a little bit here. So, hi, it's been a minute. We're going to go ahead and delve into an updated Discipline Priest guide. I did one at the start of Shadowlands. Not much really changed for Discipline throughout the first 3 seasons of PvP, unfortunately. And especially in Season 3, they kind of fell out of the meta because Holy Priest was just so insanely strong. But Discipline is back in a big way. The meta is very, very fast again. You need a lot of burst and especially AoE healing with, as you can see down here on my damage meters, Affliction Warlocks and Shadow Priests and Dot classes do a lot of damage currently. So having high AoE burst healing is very, very effective. Anyway, I have my notes here. We're going to go ahead and get into everything. So, in terms of gearing options, let me pull that back up. Sorry about that. In terms of gearing options, you have a couple nowadays. Typically, into about 95% of your games, you're going to want to just run a standard haste versatility setup. So the goal is to hit 30% haste, and anything above is gravy. And most of my gems and enchants are actually for haste. Currently, I'm set up because I was playing RMP a little while ago, so my gear is currently for RMP. I've been playing around a little bit with a mastery heavy build. We'll go ahead and close that out real quick. I've been playing around with a mastery heavy build, which is kind of fun. The only time that you really run this is if you're playing into a comp where you know that you specifically are going to be the target. So like into Red Warrior, into TSG, which is Death Knight Warrior for those of you that don't know. Anything that's going to just kind of W key at you specifically, the mastery helps because obviously, as you guys can read, your passive or your mastery passive is healing and absorption is increased by 45% with full mastery gear, and this isn't even full. A lot of this gear is unupgraded. So you can get to roughly 50% mastery, which is just 50% increased healing on targets with Atonement, which if you're the target, you're going to have Atonement on you 100% of the time. So it's just 50% increased healing regardless. Plus, you do lose a little bit of versatility, but you gain just raw throughput, which is pretty necessary. You lose about 2% damage reduction to gain 30% increased healing, which is nice. Anyway, that's very, very matchup specific. A lot of the gearing choices you'll make are going to be matchup specific, along with talents as well, but we'll get into that in a little while. So that would be your gearing options. Like I said, 95% of your games you're going to be running full haste, full verse, and that's because of the interaction that your spec has with Purge the Wicked and Atonement. If you have Purge the Wicked out on 3 targets or more, depending on what you're playing into, like if you're playing into a demo lock, any warlock, any hunter, anything that has pets, you can get out multiple Purge the Wickeds, and it's all it's going to do is boost your healing through Atonement. Atonement isn't... It's not what it once was. Back in Season 1 and 2, Atonement was always your top heal. It wasn't even close. Atonement... The game is a lot faster now. Even more so than it was back then. There were a lot of one-shots that you couldn't really predict, but outside of one-shots, the game actually was relatively slow, so Atonement did a lot of your healing. Whereas nowadays, you're not even offensively penancing, really. You're using penance mostly in a defensive way, and it's basically like a lay on hands with how it functions currently. I mean, it's critting for 15k per bolt through 40% mortal strikes or 50% mortal strikes. It's actually an insanely powerful single target healing device. And partnered with this talent, which we'll get into here in a minute, it does a lot of spread healing as well. So, typically you're not really playing offensively unless you're playing very, very specific comps. Something along the lines of like Kitty Cleave that just wants to Mongo at something. They just W key as hard as they can at something and kill it instantly. Then you're doing a little more offensive work, but even then your entire job as a healer obviously is to keep your team alive. So you would want to play a little bit more of a hybrid kind of style where you have the ability to do a good amount of throughput but also contribute damage, which is the benefit of a Discipline Priest. So we'll start touching on Speaking of which, offensive Discipline Priest. The way that you're going to want to play offensive Discipline Priest. Same build, haste first, but the entire point of it is to do maximum damage. So Castigation is your go-to because of the interaction with Penitent 1 Legendary, which is whenever you get this proc, it fires 3 additional bolts. So with Castigation, your Penance fires instead of 3 bolts. With this proc and Castigation, it now fires 7. Which, let's see if we can proc one. We got one. So, this is the healing version. That's 7. Each one is hitting for roughly 12,500 in terms of healing. Yeah, I mean, you could do the math on that. That's 90,000 healing. And on top of that, it also procced my Contrition 7 times, which is 1,500 each, roughly. 7 times. So that's an additional... Math is hard. That's an additional almost 11,000 healing. So you're looking at, just off of that penance alone, 100,000 single target healing. Just like that. And it's what? A 1.5 second cast. You get 100,000 healing out of a 1.5 second cast. Now, the only downside is it's a channel, so you can get kicked part way through it, but if you're good at baiting kicks without casting penance and then using penance when there are no kicks, or you're just casting it when you're out of line of sight, because the trick is, say I want to heal this guy, I could be out of line of sight, jump in line of sight, and then bump right back out. Can't be kicked. So there's a lot of nuance to penance. Like I said, typically, though, it's used in a very, very defensive role. You can offensively penance. It's not a bad thing. It's just you have to kind of gauge where your team is at in terms of pressure. So the next talent would be... I see a lot of priests running Body and Soul. Me personally, you'll only really run Masochism again if you're the target that's getting killed, obviously, because it gives you damage reduction. Otherwise, it's not really good. You want to play with the utility of movement speed. So personally, I like Angelic Feather. It's just a personal preference, really. Body and Soul is a little more fire and forget because it's tied to your power word shield, which you're spamming anyway. The only thing is it's a little easier to help your teammates with a little extra movement speed, which is nice. Outside of that, I have a cast at self macro for my my feathers, so it's really easy to just push a keybind and I immediately gain 40% movement speed. And it actually lasts longer. It lasts for 5 seconds as opposed to 3. This is a little more spammable, especially when Rapture's up. You can just have like permanent 40% movement speed, but that's only every 90 seconds. So then to go into a little bit more of the offensive build where your sole focus is doing damage, you play Powered Solace over Mindbender. So this is, again, if you guys have seen my other guide that I posted at the beginning of Shadowlands in 9.0, this is weighing in, or pulling more from the traditional style of Discipline, where your entire goal is to just pump as much damage as humanly possible and win the game really fast. It's completely doable in Season 4. Since casters are a little more prevalent, or much more prevalent now, especially in a little bit lower ratings, you go really fast as a Discipline Priest, so having the Mindbender actually helps immensely in terms of your longevity in arenas. Like, there was a game I was playing. Let me see if I can find it. I don't remember where it was, but it was like a 14-minute arena. I can't recall offhand what map it was. I mean, a lot of these games are sub 5 minutes, or most of these games are sub 5 minutes. They're roughly... I mean, this one is the only one that's over 5 minutes on this entire list. And this is from 3 days of queues. So, realistically, you don't really need... And in most of those games I'm going to... Most of them. There's just so much damage currently, and it's all really hard to heal. Anyway, Mindbender helps a lot. That's the hybrid build I was talking about earlier, but in terms of just raw damage output, this would be the setup you would want to run. Now, it does vary. You can run Shining Force in some instances, so like on Blade's Edge, or the Mecha Gnome arena, I forget the name of it. Anything with a Z axis, which is a vertical axis, Shining Force is good, especially into melees, because then they have to use all their mobility getting back off or back up on the z-axis, so it's useful. It has its uses, it has its niches. It's not a 100% pick. Neither is Psychic Voice, but Psychic Voice is like a 95%. Most of your games you're going to play this. So again, we touched on Contrition earlier, where when you're excuse me, when you're defensive penanting, this thing actually pumps healing. It does a lot of healing. There's been times where I've been able to let my team tank a Warlock's Dark Soul, which if anybody's played arenas in Season 4, they know that Dark Soul for an Affliction Warlock does astronomical amounts of damage with Radiance, Penance, Radiance, and my entire team just stays healthy, and then you just follow it up with spam Rapture Shields, and you virtually take no damage from the Warlock's entire cooldowns. So Contrition is really, really useful if you're playing more of a defensive style. So if you're playing, personally, if you're playing RMP or jungle, I think that playing the Mindbender build is much, much better. Just because in a setup comp, your damage is icing on the cake. Realistically, if you get clean setups, your damage is not needed to kill something. To force cooldowns, maybe. Your damage is useful and needed. But in terms of raw kill potential, if you're getting a perfect triple CC cross, your damage isn't needed. Your rogue and your mage, or your hunter and your feral, are going to kill whatever is in that CC. Now, if the opponent trades cooldowns, then it obviously extends the game, and you have to go through the whole cycle. It's a cycle. The cycle of setting up your CC again. Sorry, I'm a little bit tongue-tied for whatever reason. But in terms of just in a vacuum, your damage is not necessary to score kills and get wins. That's why, personally for me, because I play setup comps, I play jungle, I play RMP, I'm not a cleave head, per se. So if you play setup comps, the Mindbender build is, me personally, what I like to play. And even when I dabble in cleaves, I still play the Mindbender build, because your melees, especially with how prevalent Warlocks and Elemental Shamans and Boomkins all are in the, 2K to 2400 area, that's, where they have their field days. If you're playing double melee into that, you're going to have a bad time, especially if you're a mana-hungry healer like Discipline is. So having the ability to have extra mana longevity is very, very nice. But in terms of just outputting damage, Sins of the Many obviously is just going to be your best bet, because you have 9% increased damage at all times. Sometimes it goes up to 12, depending on how many Atonement targets you have. So if you're at max Atonements in arenas, which is 3, it's 9%. I believe it's actually 8%. Could be wrong here. Yeah, it's 8%, not 9%. Sorry, my brain is fried. So 8% increased damage with 3 Atonements. 8% damage is no small slouch. That's actually a lot of damage. And that adds up. That adds up over an entire arena, especially long ones. At higher ratings, you're going to be going for drinks. The games are going to extend, just because players are better at trading cooldowns efficiently. So you're not just going to land random kills. In terms of PvP talents, since, like I said, this is your full damage build, and then you would just swap these out, and this is your mana save build, and then a build to keep yourself alive if you're the target. Personally, I just swap out Castigation for Twist of Fate. It's 1 less Penance Bolt, and you get 20% increased healing if you drop below 35% HP. That's basically all this is. So 20% increased healing on everything, as opposed to just 1 extra Penance Bolt, which is 10k every 10 seconds. So you get 1k HPS, which is a good amount of HPS, or you just get 20% increased HPS. Me personally, I take this. That's just a personal preference, though. Anyway, we'll move into PvP talents. So, again, if you guys watch my previous guide, you never not play this. You always play Ultimate Radiance. It is 100% taken in every single game, regardless of anything. The only caveat I will give you is in some, and I will say some with an asterisk, because I mean very, very few games, in 2s, you will swap this out for something. Now, That being said, in 3v3 rated arena, you will always take this. This is a 100% pick. You do not swap it out for anything. So effectively, you're playing with 2 PvP talents. In 95% of your games, you will run these 3 talents. Most of them. Into Rogue Mage Priest, I personally, and I see a lot of high-rated priests play Purification. It gives you a second Dispel to dispel polymorphs and roots, just to keep your team aggressive, because the way that you beat RMP is by counter-pressuring their goes. Counter-pressuring and peeling their goes. That's all you do. Your rogue cheap shots, or the enemy rogue cheap shots you, and then is walking back to, or step cheaps, or step kidneys, whatever, you, and then is walking back to your buddy. Your teammate then just peels the rogue or peels the mage, stops the poly, what have you, does something. That's, that's all it is. So playing into RMP, I play Purification. This is literally the exact setup I play in RMP every game. The only thing that I change is I obviously have a gear set that's listed as RMP. That changes to this legendary, which just reduces incoming crowd control and gives me a little extra versatility coming out of the crowd control. That's the only difference. And obviously I have mastery boots because haste boots don't exist outside of a crafted legendary. So Sephu's double dispel into RMP. That's really the only time you ever run Purification. I've seen it get play into elemental shamans, especially because their build is so centric around having lava or flame shock on multiple targets. So that way when they primordial wave, they can just machine gun down an entire team. I personally am not a big fan of it because dispelling with control lava hurts. And again, into they're typically playing with warlocks and shadow priests, so you get negative benefits or negative effects from both targets, not just the LA shaman. But it's good to know that it's there. Outside of Dome and double dispel, the only other thing that I really see being played is Dark Archangel. And that's, again, just into stuff like you're playing with a turbo cleave, or you're just cleaving hard, man. Stuff where you just want to win the game as fast as humanly possible. You just buff your whole team with extra damage. Like I said, typically you'll be playing this setup in the majority of your games, because the 15% extra mana, or the 15% less mana that you spend from Inner Light is insane. Having extra mana matters so much on a Discipline Priest. It is crazy. So the talents don't really vary that much. There is some variance, obviously, from the last guide that I made, where you literally just played this setup every single game with this legendary, because we didn't have double legendary back then. So you just played this setup every single game, no matter what. You played with this, especially if you're playing RMP. You played Eternal Gladiator's Resonator. Well, this didn't exist in Season 1, did it? Yeah. Anyway, you played Penitent 1. You just played this, went full damage, won games. Now there's a little more variance. The mana effect, because your mana regen did get touched. Priest mana regen got touched. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. Holy Priest was too strong, so they needed a nerf. And those are your talents. We'll go over a 2s build and an RBG build real quick, just because I know that was asked about in the comments on the last video. So we'll touch on a 2s build here. So 2s build would require you to be either Kyrian or Venthyr. Personally, I like Kyrian. It's just more damage and it's a little more fun. It does get peeled. That's the one counter to Kyrian is, as soon as you cast Ascended Boon, the enemy team, especially if they're good, is just going to CC you. They're not going to let you cast anything because it's all instant casts. So once the cast bar goes through and you're in your Ascended Boon, they're just going to CC you, so you get no value out of it. But me personally, I play Kyrian. If I play 2s, I run Schism, Power Word Solace, Sins of the Many, and Dark Archangel. And you actually would go Inner Shadow because it's extra damage. You just go max damage in 2s. That's your whole job, is to just win the game as fast as possible. Mana doesn't matter. Kill things. That's how I view 2s. Most Discipline Priests would agree with me because they play with stuff like Demon Hunters and Feral Druids that are just looking to win the game with a little bit of control and a lot of damage. RBGs is Different, but it's the same. Personally, I play Night Fae in RBGs. I've seen a lot of disc priests play Necrolord because the Necrolord Covenant ability, which shoots out the plague, actually does a good amount of healing, especially in an AoE situation. So if you got 10 targets stacked around each other in a team fight on, like, Eye of the Storm, for example, you're going to get a lot of value out of, I think it's Devouring Plague. No, Devouring Plague is class-centric. Unholy Nova. Sorry, Unholy Transfusion. So if you put that on 10 targets and you got a Warlock and a Boomkin on your BG team that are just cleaving heavy, you're going to get a lot of value out of Unholy Transfusion, which is nice. It's more of a niche playstyle. Typically, you're going to be playing Night Fae, just because it's damage reduction, it gives a little bit of CDR, and the mana regen is the big one. If you're in voice comms and you're in organized RPGs, your target caller is going to be calling who everyone is going to be hitting, and the way that this functions increases any direct attack against the target restore 0.5% mana. So anything that is a direct attack, so auto attacks, casted melee abilities, anything along those lines, give you 0.5% of your mana, which is insane in an RPG where you most likely are going to have a Fury Warrior and an Unholy Death Knight at the very minimum, in high-rated RPGs at least. And you'll probably have a Demon Hunter and your tank hitting a target. So that alone is 4 instances proccing that. So that's 2% of your mana just from there, right there in one instance. And it lasts for 20 seconds. So realistically, you can regenerate a lot of mana with Fae Guardians, which is really, really nice in RPGs because you're doing a lot of AoE healing. So you go in pretty quick in RPGs. But in RPGs, typically, it's okay to run a lot of different things. Me personally, I run Purification just to have extra dispels in teamfights. Dispelling in teamfights in RPGs is actually massive. I will caveat that. Don't kill yourself into UA locks. Pay attention to Unstable Affliction. A good RPG team is going to have a UA lock. Just pay attention. If you're dispelling and you're half HP, and then you dispel again, and now you're 10% HP, you're just going to get swapped through and killed. If your other healers are good, you just call out, hey, I'm dispelling such and such. Bing, bang, boom, your healers throw, a renew or whatever on you, a rejuve. Renewing Mist, since you're probably not going to be playing at a high level with druids or holy priests. You're going to be playing with other discipline priests, holy paladins, and mistweavers at a high level, at least. In YOLO RPGs, you'll play with whatever. And then again, you just run. Personally, I prefer Twist of Fate, but that's just because in coordinated RPGs, the enemy team is going to be targeting one specific person, so as soon as that person's HP spikes from full to almost dead, you Radiance them once, now you're doing Giga Healing everywhere. So, and map dependent, you play Shining Force. So like, Arathi Basin, Eye of the Storm, again, anything with a big Z-axis, Eye of the Storm in particular, because you can kill people by knocking them off the map. Shining Force is really, really useful. You can kill people on AB as well, Arathi Basin as well, but it's a lot harder to do because there's a lot more movement ability, like Warrior Leap, Mage Blink, DH Backflip, Druid Shapeshift, and Wild Charge, that kind of stuff. So, Psychic Voice is typically your go-to, especially on like flag maps or something like that. And that would be your RBG build. So, now that talents have been talked about, we'll touch on Covenants and Soulbinds. I already kind of did when I was talking about talents and 2s and RBGs, but typically in Rated 3's arena, you're going to play Night Fae in 90% of your games. The only time that I really play Venthyr is when I play RMP, just because having extra damage on your setups is nice. When I play jungle, I play Night Fae, because jungle can go longer, because you have a utility class, you have a hybrid, so you have off-healing. So the off-healing helps counteract fast-paced comps, if only a little bit. But you have off-healing and spammable CC with Cyclones. So if your Feral is good at extending games and live lording himself and your Hunter during enemy team setups, then Night Fae is definitely the option, because you can then also extend games by having a larger mana pool to draw from. Now, at higher ends, I have seen a lot of priests that play with jungle play Kyrian just to overwhelm teams with damage. It's viable. I've tried it. I see how valuable it is. I personally am not a fan of it, but it does work. I'm not saying it's awful. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying if you want to just gas pedal down teams, by all means. I like playing a little bit more conservative and just long gaming, essentially. But that's just all comes down to preference. So we touched on it briefly. This is going to be a much shorter video than the last one, apparently. We touched on it briefly, but legendaries are pretty set in stone. You don't really change off of Penitent 1 and obviously Unity for pretty much anything except for RMP, or if you know you're getting trained. So even on my mastery setup, I have Penitent 1 and Unity, just because it just changes from haste to mastery. So again, the only time you really change is if you're going RMP. Now, I do run this sometimes into melee cleaves, especially like DHDK, just because having the reduction in CC is nice. And also, 80 versatility is actually a lot. Like, let me find a piece of gear that has 80 versatility on it, roughly. Of course, none of my... So, 73 verse. Let's see how much versatility percentage I lose. We're sitting at 34.3. If I take off that, I lose almost an entire percent of versatility. So, like, having an extra 1% verse... Granted, that's only 0.5% of damage reduction, but it's an extra percent of damage, which for Discipline you double dip. Because you deal more damage, which also means you deal more healing, which is really nice. Again, the big reason you would wear Sephuz into melee cleaves is just the additional 10%. Crowd control reduction, which is nice. It's not the end of the world if you sit another half a second in a Strangulate or another half a second in a Chaos Nova. But that half a second on both of those, that's an extra second. That's a global that you could be using to save yourself. And in an entire, DHDK game, you're getting to second slappy hands. That's 2 minutes. That's 2 Strangulates. That's 2 Chaos Novas. 4 Fel Eruptions. So you're looking at 2 seconds on just the Fel Eruptions, 1 second total on the Novas, 1 second total on the Strangulates. I mean, that's 4 extra globals into one of the highest single target, like, Mongo teams you're going to play against. Other than Ret Warrior. Ret Warrior obviously is just, like, crazy. So having 4 extra globals to top yourself means something. So it's just something to think about. Again, it's how you feel you can play into stuff. Now, I'm not saying play Sephuz into every melee cleave ever. It's probably better just to play Penitent 1, just because, like I said, if you're defensive penencing, hitting yourself for fucking 14k, including contrition, for 7 penance bolts, that's a lot. Like, that's a lot. That's almost 100,000 healing, just instantly. On top of the fact that you radianced yourself for like 25k, and the whole time you have atonement ticks going from your Purge the Wickeds and everything. You're popping your Mind Bender. You're blowing your Big Dome, because in the melee cleaves you're not gonna not play Big Dome. That's 50% damage reduction on a 90-second cooldown. That's too good to pass up. You have your Gladiator's Eternal Aegis, which is 42,000 healing. It's pretty hard to kill a Discipline Priest if they're good. I'm just letting you know that Sephuz does help, but it's not a requirement to play in a melee cleaves. The only time that I feel that it's required to play Sephuz is into RMP. Just because they're going to set up on you. It might be good into jungle too. I haven't really played it into jungle all that much. Jungle mirrors are kind of wonky. It basically is just whoever gets first trap and doesn't mess up is who wins. Unless you get outplayed, and then it's a whole different ballgame. But typically, RMP is the only comp I play anything different than just Penitent 1. Which is unfortunate, because we have a lot of cool interactions with legendaries, but none of them are really viable for PvP outside of this one. and Sefu's, which is the only other one that I've seen, and you'll see it more often than not. The only times you'll ever really see it are with Rat Warrior. Is, ironically enough, the same gear that you run for Shadow, where you just run Twins of the Sun Priestess, which means that you and your target gain PI, and you just play full Mongo, go damage, and you both gain 25% haste, which is really nice. But outside of that, you just run Penitent 1 and do a lot of penance things. So, my previous guide that I already posted, like I said, at the start of Shadowlands in 9.0, had macros and add-ons. So if you guys would want to go and view that video as well, then by all means go and take a look at what macros and what add-ons that I play with. Nothing's really changed. I've just kind of moved my UI around a little bit just so it's a little less cluttered to me. Outside of that, hope you guys enjoy, and best of luck in the arena.